Hello, my name's Doug McKee. I'm a family practice doctor at the Vieira VA Outpatient Clinic in Vieira, Florida. I've been involved in the VA's project for transition to ICD-10 now for about a year and a half. I've given two different, much longer VHU talks with colleagues that are now available on demand at the VHU campus. I've also been involved in systems testing for ICD-10 with CPRS and VISTA, as well as multiple ICD-10 committees, both on national and VISN levels. I'm here today to discuss an important topic that will affect each and every one of you, the transition to the ICD-10 code set. My talk today is just to introduce you to some of the concepts of ICD-10 and to provide awareness that this is coming. Thus, the title of my talk today, October 1st, 2014, ICD-10 is coming. Now, many of you have heard about ICD-10 and may still be hoping that it'll go away. While it did get delayed by a year and a half until October 1st, 2014, there is no thought that there will be further delays. So why is this happening? Well, the main reason that the U.S. is transitioning to ICD-10 is that it is extremely difficult to glean any useful data on healthcare needs, diseases, or injuries worldwide if you're not all using the same data capture system. ICD-10 is no longer supported by the World Health Organization for reporting morbidity data around the world. So to conform for comparing international morbidity data and to identify health threats, the U.S. is transitioning to ICD-10. As we become a more global community, it's vital that the U.S. healthcare data represent current medical conditions and technologies with standard clinical terminology compatible with the international version of ICD-10. New health threats such as anthrax and SARS and monkeypox cannot be easily identified with outdated ICD-9 codes, but can be communicated through the ICD-10 code set. The U.S. has limited ability right now to track and respond internationally to disease data when real-time information sharing is critical for public health. 114 countries around the globe have adopted ICD-10, and they have done this for reporting morbidity data, comparing international data, and for identifying new health threats. However, on a side note, no one has adopted ICD-10 for payment. Only the U.S. ICD-10, CM, and PCS code sets are designed to be used for this. Now, once October 1st, 2014 arrives, all HIPAA-covered entities will need to abide by the following. Inpatient discharges occurring on or after October 1st, 2014 will need to use ICD-10 diagnosis and procedure codes. And any discharges occurring before October 1st will need to use ICD-9 codes even if they're submitted after October 1st. For outpatient encounter dates, these will be utilized to verify whether ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes should be submitted regardless of when they're entered. So how does ICD-10 affect you? And what does it change? Well, first, the change that most of you have probably heard about by now is the volume. ICD-9 diagnosis volume increases from 14,025 diagnoses to 69,101 in ICD-10, while ICD-9 procedure volume increases from 3,824 to 71,957 hospital procedure codes. Now, next is the change in format. ICD-10 consists of alphanumeric codes consisting of up to 7 characters in length, as well as an increase in combination codes representing both disease and manifestation. ICD-10 also changes in classification and organization of the code set. New classification categories of codes have been added. Codes have also been reclassified to different categories. For instance, bee stings were reclassified from insect bite, which was one code, to each body site where a bite could occur. Examples are to come later in the talk. And then last are changes in the guidelines. The good news is that guidelines for coding diagnoses are essentially unchanged. Guidelines for coding procedures, though, are significantly different, but that, thankfully, is something that will fall to our friends the coders. So let's first look at the change that stands out the most, the volume. I am reiterating these numbers just to emphasize that yes, this is actually true. One of the biggest differences between ICD-9 and ICD-10 is the sheer number of codes. The number of diagnosis codes increased from 14,025 to 69,101. The ICD-10 coding rules will be very similar to ICD-9, but we're going to see some terminology changes. For example, history of becomes in remission. The ICD-9 procedure codes will see a major overhaul as well. The clinical staff will continue to use CPT as they do today. But while the code increase of approximately 4,000 to over 70,000 is an enormous change, this piece of the ICD-10 pie will only be used by the coders. So we can say that these changes do not impact the providers except for the fact that there are some terminology changes. One example is that in ICD-10 the term incision will no longer be used. Resection will be used instead. However, for today we'll focus on the diagnosis coding. So let me give you an example of a real ICD-10 code next. X90.27XA. It sounds very foreign with all the letters and numbers mixed together, doesn't it? However, this is a real ICD-10 code. This is the code for drowning and submersion due to falling and jumping from burning water skis. And yes, this is a real code. This leads perfectly, though, to examining the format changes in ICD-10. An ICD-10 code will require at least 3 digits, but can consist of up to 7 digits, with the 7th digit extension representing visit encounter or sequelae for injuries and external causes. The first 3 possible places in the code represent the general category, while the next 3 represent the etiology, anatomic site, and severity. Certainly, many codes do not use every possible position in the code structure. A prime example is also a prime irony of the ICD-10 nomenclature. The ICD-10 code for hypertension is actually I-10. At least that's one you can remember very quickly. So let's next look at a real example of an ICD-10 code that does use all 7 places. This is S31.623A, which is laceration with foreign body of abdominal wall, right lower quadrant with penetration into peritoneal cavity, initial encounter, as opposed to the much less specific code in ICD-9 for laceration trunk. Now, as you can see, ICD-10 allows for much more specific coding. One question that does often come up is, what is initial encounter? And what does that refer to? This refers to the initial encounter with this patient for this problem. The follow-up visit for this problem would change to subsequent encounter. Now, this is as opposed to a subsequent repeat laceration with foreign body of the abdominal wall, etc. The saddest part for me with this format change is that all the ICD-9 codes that I've inadvertently memorized over the years are now going to be worthless. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. How many of you can't instantly tell me what the diagnoses are for the ICD-9 codes of 250.00 and 401.9? But at any rate, let's go on to some examples of the classification and organizational changes in ICD-10. Here's the ICD-9 code for insect bite. And it's 919.4. That's simple, right? And concise. But it doesn't really give you a lot of information and would require a chart review to see what really happened. So let's look at what ICD-10 does with this. Here are just some of the choices for the same encounter in ICD-10. Now, I know you can't read this slide very well, but this is just to show you the scope of possible codes for something that had only one code in ICD-9. Note that this has every possible location on the body and relates whether this is an initial encounter versus a subsequent encounter. And again, subsequent does not mean that the patient got bitten again, just that you're seeing him or her back in follow-up for the same bite. This slide also doesn't show every possibility out there, so there are more than what you can even see on the slide. Another example of differences in the coding systems is a code for tobacco use disorder. Now this slide shows the familiar 305.1 for ICD-9 and the numerous possibilities for the same diagnosis in ICD-10. While many of the ICD-10 code examples seem a little bit over the top at times, this is one I can actually like. I wouldn't mind having a code in the chart telling me quickly if the patient chews tobacco or smokes cigarettes. Seems somewhat clinically relevant at times, right? But here are some codes, though, that tend to add to the reputation that ICD-10 is cumbersome and a little silly at times. In ICD-10, there are 72 different birds classified who could inflict injuries such as striking and pecking, and we can capture the location of the avian assaults. These location codes are big in ICD-10, and in an attempt to be able to track locations of incidents through coding reviews. For example, these on the slide are just a smattering of the locations available to code for in ICD-10. At an opera, at a museum, in a mobile home room-specific as opposed to a single-family dwelling, and at a pool located at a prison. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. Prior to learning about ICD-10, I was not even aware that we had prison pools. But hey, I guess maybe that's a good thing I didn't know that, right? But please know there are also codes for injury locations in a regular pool filled with water versus an empty pool as well. Seems like the dream of grad students somewhere to track the injuries that happen in empty pools. And eventually this is exactly what the level of specificity in coding is for, to be able to track and use the data submitted through coding encounters. This actually leads, though, to one of the most important pieces of ICD-10 that will affect the providers the most, the documentation. ICD-10 adds an enormous amount of detail, including timing, location, severity, and laterality. You will need to have these items in your documentation notes to reflect the code. Not long after implementation, coders and insurance companies will be reviewing charts to see if the documentation matches the codes, which will, only in the US, link to payment. While most of us probably already document much of that in the HPI, physical exam, and assessment and plan, it is worth noting. Now here are some examples where documentation needs to be in your note matching the diagnoses. This is C50.212, malignant neoplasm of upper inner quadrant of the left female breast. This is also they also have a code then for the neoplasm in all the different quadrants and male breast versus female breast. The lesion of the left lower eyelid, again very specific to the location. Phlebitis and thrombophlebitis in the right lower extremity, and then L89.213, pressure ulcer of the right hip, stage 3. So this just shows you how specific the coding is and that you will really need in your chart to document where these things are located so that when you put your ICD-10 code in, it matches. And here's an example of specificity in ICD-10 as well. ICD-10 diagnoses will have to be much more specific than what we're used to with ICD-9. For example, in ICD-10, the category for pericarditis is I31. Now, in choosing the correct code, you can't stop there. You will need to choose from the following on the slide, the 0.0 through 0.9. Note that the 0.9 will most likely not be accepted in many cases, though, the further out we are from implementation of ICD-10. You will likely be asked to be more specific if that code is chosen. Now, not all of your daily coding is going to be too crazy, but these categories on the slide of ICD-10 codes represent the most significant changes and will require attention to detail in order to reach the correct code assignment. These are diabetes, injuries, cerebral infarctions, acute MI, neoplasms, and musculoskeletal conditions. Now note that there are 13,000 codes for fractures alone. Yes, 13,000. My apologies to the orthopedists in the audience. I do want to show you one site that will let you explore the coding structure and system of ICD-10. This is www.icd10data.com. This is a free website and may be worthwhile looking at to just familiarize yourself a little bit with how ICD-10 works. So here's one example using the ICD-10data.com website of how to search for a fairly common code. This is an example of just one type of search functionality, though, in trying to find codes for ICD-10. So let me show you how I found the code for a type 2 diabetic patient with a complication of a diabetic foot ulcer. First is E11 for type 2 diabetes. Now next we'll look at the E11 subcategories. I know you can't decipher this at this font, but this is just to give you an idea of how many subcategories exist for a common diagnosis. Now this is the first page, and here is page 2, and showing the code E11.621 for type 2 diabetes with the complication of a foot ulcer. However, you would be prompted for another code after that to allow for more detail. So here are additional codes for specificity with location and severity. So let's say in this case that this is a non-pressure ulcer of the right heel with fat layer exposure. The additional code would be L97.412. Wow. As you can see, this is much more involved than most ICD-9 coding, but it also communicates significantly more detail in the patient's chart just by examining the coding. Now, as you can see from our search example, though, there is a great need for excellent search functionality to find correct codes. So who does this change to ICD-10 affect in the VA system? Well, here are some examples on the slide. However, there are many more examples. But here this shows you basically everyone who uses information system applications affected by ICD-10, clinical staff who input any ICD-10 codes, research and reporting. But in fact, ICD-10 affects basically anyone who touches a code. You can also see that this affects most, if not all, of our electronic systems within the VA system. So IT and HIMSS have the most daunting task in front of them in making this transition. Luckily for us, most of what has to happen for the transition will happen in the background. So what is the VA doing to prepare? Rest assured that there is much actively being done, and much has already been done to get ready for this transition, including the things listed on this slide. The VA is probably better suited than most in the industry to get this done because of the size of our system and the way the VA can coordinate and leverage its talent on a national level. And the VA is working on multiple aspects of CPRS and VISTA that impact the clinician's daily routine. One is national encounter forms, which will be updated with ICD-10 codes for use by local sites. To make documentation easier, national templates will be updated to account for the additional specificity in documentation. Because of this, it may be easier in the end to use national templates rather than local ones. And lexicon search functionality is expected to be easier and faster, but is probably the most daunting task for the behind-the-scenes folks because it is so challenging to do a search for the perfect one code out of 70,000. You may ask, though, what are the real benefits to using ICD-10 for the clinician? Well, this is a list of just a few of the ways and systems that will benefit from accurate ICD-10 coding. However, as with anything, garbage in, garbage out. It will be very important for us as clinicians to get familiar with how to code properly for any of these benefits to come to fruition. In the end, it is our patient, and really at a population level particularly, who will benefit from this system. So let's end today's talk with a couple more quick examples of codes that show how much more specificity will be available in ICD-10. Here are R46.1, R46.0, and W22.02XA. These are bizarre personal appearance, low-level personal hygiene, and walked into lamppost initial encounter. Hopefully we won't have the occasion to use these codes much, but I truly hope that these will never all three be in the same encounter for the same patient. And last, here are some other classics. These codes deal with a spacecraft crash, injuring the occupant, unspecified balloon accident, prolonged stay in a weightless environment, other contact with dolphin, initial encounter, pedestrian on foot injured in collision with roller skates, subsequent encounter. And last, Y34. This is unspecified event, undetermined intent. With as much specificity that ICD-10 has, I find Y34 very ironic. I have yet to think of a practical application for that one, other than maybe simply giving up on your ICD-10 code search. Well, hopefully I've been able to give you an awareness today of what ICD-10 is all about. It is a major change to our healthcare system as a whole, both inside the VA and outside the VA. I think the best advice I can give you after today's talk is, don't panic. Overall, the thought of this transition tends to cause chest pain, RO7.1, and panic attacks, F41.0, and may make you feel like you've been sucked into a jet engine, V97.33XA initial encounter, or have been hit by a tsunami caused by an earthquake or tidal wave, which is X37.41. While the transition to ICD-10 presents many challenges, the VA has been working on this for some time now, and is endeavoring to make this transition as smooth as possible. Once we transition to ICD-10, the medical community should be able to see the benefits of communicating better detail in patients' diagnoses for our patients and our entire healthcare system. If you want to stay connected, there are many ways to get information about ICD-10 in our system. First and foremost, there are multiple VHU talks on many topics involving ICD-10 that are on demand, and there are many more to come. The intranet site listed here and the listserv are very useful sites as well for you. And you can visit the Medicare website for detailed information on ICD-10 at cms.gov. Also, if you have more specific ICD-10 questions, you can email them to VHA ICD-10 Q&As from the global address list in Outlook. You will also be updated periodically on new training materials and opportunities as they become available. For fun, if there is such a thing with ICD-10, I would suggest doing a YouTube search on ICD-10 codes as well as a Google search. It's truly amazing to see some of the bizarre codes that exist in the fringes of these 69,000 codes. And some of the video representations of the real ICD-10 codes on YouTube are pretty entertaining. Well, thanks for watching today. Take care and have a great day.